Well, the supermarket inquiry is directly related to the so-called cost of living crisis in Australia. Now, as I've said here in the past, what better way for government to redirect people's attention about the cost of living than to shift the blame squarely to the big supermarkets, Coles and Woolworths, with allegations of price gouging. A Senate inquiry, well, that'll do the job for them. But supermarket retailing in Australia certainly is less concentrated than it once was because of the introduction, especially of Aldi and Costco. Now, an inquiry into the supermarkets is no bad thing to ensure especially that current laws don't block new competition from coming in. But someone who should be a pretty good judge of the market right now is Fred Harrison, Chief Executive of the independent supermarket chain Ritchie's IGA. Now, Fred's been Chief Executive there for a long, long time. Ritchie's has been competing with the big supermarkets here for 153 years. So I asked Fred this week if price gouging in the supermarkets, in his opinion, is real or not.
I don't see profiteering. I know, and I can quote you our business. This will be the second financial year in a row where we'll see a small decrease in profits. So inflation, as I said, is not necessarily helping our business. So for us, what we need to do is keep an eye on top line sales, keep fighting to grow sales. So, we've gone backwards a little, not a lot, in the last couple of years. So for us, I can look anyone in the eye and say there is zero price gouging happening in Ritchie's.
Now, as I say, an investigation into the supermarkets is a good thing, especially the way they manage their relationships with suppliers. One of the key suppliers is the Australian food manufacturing industry, represented by the Australian Food and Grocery Council. Tanya Barden is its Chief Executive and joins me now. Tanya, always good to chat to you. I want to go to this heart, the concentration of power, whether it's shifted because of the introduction of Aldi and Costco, and therefore the need for this inquiry into our supermarkets right now.
So there have been several new entrants into the market over the last couple of decades, and as you mentioned, we've got now Aldi, Costco, Amazon, but it does remain the case that we have a heavily concentrated supermarket sector, and it is the second most concentrated market in the world after New Zealand. And one of the impacts of that is that for suppliers, you don't have much choice. You don't have the ability to diversify your risk. If you're having a challenge with one supermarket and you are not able to resolve that, then that's a large proportion of your business that's at risk. Where you look at other markets, the greater number of supermarkets does provide more balance then in those negotiating arrangements and the treatments of suppliers.
On the subject of balance, where is the balance of power in the relationship between a food manufacturer in this country and our big supermarkets? Who holds that power?
So it is absolutely with the supermarkets. So a supermarket will have thousands of suppliers, but for any one food or grocery manufacturer, they could have, potentially 80% of their business sitting with the two major supermarkets. And so if things go sour with one of those, then that's a big risk and they don't have that ability to diversify. So one of the things we think is really important as the Food and Grocery Council is to investigate what ways we can try and boost more competitors into the Australian market to help suppliers have a broader range of customers to be able to sell their products to.
So has the introduction of Aldi and Costco, because as I understand it, the introduction of both of those allowed many food manufacturers here in Australia, many family-owned businesses even, to find markets outside of Australia that they might not have otherwise found just dealing with Coles and Woolworths.
That's right. Export is a big opportunity for the food and grocery industry, and sometimes they'll do that themselves and sometimes they'll partner with a retailer from Australia. I think the other really important factor, though, is going back to when Aldi and Costco came into the market, back in the 2000s. The supermarket retailers competed really aggressively and consumers did quite well through that period, with food and grocery prices low for a very long period. However, what happened was that suppliers were funding a lot of that competition between the retailers. And what that meant was that input costs for manufacturers were going up by 50% and their wholesale prices to the retailers were only going up by half of that. And that meant that as an industry, food and grocery manufacturing profits fell from $8 billion to $5 billion, and capital investment, research and development really stagnated through the industry in that decade before COVID. And that meant that a lot of efficiencies were made, but there was no fat left in the system. Then along came COVID and we saw the significant supply chain disruptions, big cost increases, as well as then geopolitical tensions, which have continued to put upward pressure on commodity prices, as well as transport, as well as labour and fuel and energy and all of these inputs. And so that meant that there was a really significant amount of cost pressure on manufacturers, but not the ability to be able to absorb, given that history of the decade before and the pressure the industry was under.
So in other words, the pricing power, you say the power is with the supermarkets, but that's pricing power, but that's also the power over the business itself as to whether it lives or die if a large proportion of the revenue is just coming from one or two sources.
Yeah, look, and these are the factors that contributed to why the Food and Grocery Council worked with the supermarkets and governments to introduce a code of conduct. So, you know, the effect of the concentration is to impact on suppliers. And so we worked closely with them to put in place a code of conduct that isn't going to be a panacea. It doesn't solve for all of the challenges brought about by the market concentration, but it gives the suppliers more certainty, more trust, more transparency. They're the aims of what the Food and Grocery Code is trying to achieve, to give a bit more balance in some of those negotiations between the retailers and the suppliers.
So, Tanya, one part of your submission to this Senate inquiry is really about giving the independent reviewer at the Food and Grocery Code of Conduct more power to be able to make stronger determinations against supermarkets in favour potentially of your members.
Yeah, look, what is most important is to recognise that suppliers do have a fear of retribution, and that reflects a market imbalance. And so through working with the supermarkets, the Code of Conduct has put in place these code arbiters that allow suppliers to raise disputes, but also created this role of an independent reviewer. And one of the things we'd like to see that reviewer do is look more at where there are systemic patterns of behaviour that are poor across the market. It's always going to be the case that an individual supplier is going to be reluctant to go to court, to go to the ACCC and to really make their case publicly. But where we can see that there are common patterns of behaviour across the market, and the independent reviewer or the Food and Grocery Council can go and have those conversations with the retailers constructively to help show where there are areas of their business that need to improve in terms of how they're treating the suppliers. And I must say that there's genuine receptiveness from the retailers to that sort of feedback.
So then you also ask for the government itself to make some sort of a contribution to ensure that food manufacturers in this country are robust and that there is job creation. We know in the past there's been controversy when there's been problems at food manufacturers as to whether governments should subsidise them and support them or whether they should let them go broke.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the feature of the decade before COVID was one of declining profitability across the industry. And we do know that there's, criticism of multinational companies in Australia, but that the margins that the multinationals and other food manufacturers make in Australia is below global averages. So that means that when they're looking to reinvest in new capital equipment, they have to make a decision about whether to retain or grow that investment in Australia and the jobs along with it, or whether they move that offshore into other areas. Now, we have seen with grocery items more of that offshoring happening, and we don't want to see that continue or to happen in food. So we do say to governments that we really need to get behind the food and grocery industry, and one of the ways they can do that is to support investment through tax incentives, accelerated depreciation that will stimulate more investment into the industry here so that we can retain our global competitiveness.
And it seems that's the catch-22, isn't it? If they don't have enough money coming from the supermarkets to be able to invest and innovate, then what happens is their businesses slowly decline. They need the investment to be able to do the innovation, and not only for Australian sourced, sort of suppliers and customers, but also for those overseas.
Yeah, that's right. And that's where we say that, first of all, let's see if we can boost more competitors, new entrants into the Australian market. We had Kaufland looking to enter Australia a number of years ago, and Let's learn from that experience of why they ended up pulling the pin on the Australian market and see how we can avoid that in the future. But in the meantime, how do we deal with the effect of that concentration on suppliers? And one lever for governments is to support investment in this really important industry that employs 275,000 people. And 40% of those are in rural and regional areas and are often the lifeblood of those communities. We need to really get behind manufacturing in this country and see that this is the biggest manufacturing sector and what's the role for governments in supporting that investment happening here.
Tanya Barden, always good to chat to you and many thanks for your time today.
Thanks very much, Ross.